Hello, and welcome to Workplace Stories, the podcast where human capital experts share their real-world experiences and insights. Hosted by Red Thread Research, Workplace Stories surfaces the latest industry trends, innovative talent strategies, and best practices for success. Tune in for practical advice on how to best transform your workplace.
Hey, welcome to Workplace Stories. I'm Danny Johnson.
And I'm Stacia Gar.
And today we had the opportunity to talk to Lori Niles-Hoffman, who's a brilliant EdTech strategist and the author of the recent book, The 8 Levers of EdTech Transformation. Stacia, what stood out to you in this conversation?
The fact that the levers come before the transformation.
The tech transformation.
Tech transformation, yeah. So often people just jump into what has to happen with the tech. And Lori's book really focuses on the 8 things that she believes need to be figured out and aligned before you get to the EdTech transformation. So I thought that was really cool. Another thing that jumped out at me, we asked her, of those 8 levers, like choosing your favorite children, which one is the most favored or most important, and which one is the most overlooked? And she said for the most favored, it was the ecosystems, that was the most important one to be thinking about right now. And that the one she thought that people didn't do as well is stakeholder management, which I think is really interesting and relevant given that stakeholders are changing and the cost pressure on every part of the business is high. And so how do you within L&D show your value and manage stakeholders while you're doing that? I thought that was really good. And then the third thing was we had this little riff that wasn't planned on if all of this HR technology is changing and we're going to be accessing it via our little line of text or via voice, and it could then the content or ideas or data gets delivered to us. What happens to those companies that no longer have a front end, really? They don't have a UI or a UX with which to distinguish themselves. And instead, they're going to have to differentiate based on something else. So we talked about what some of the different ideas were. I don't know that we got to an answer, but I don't feel like people are talking about this enough. And I love that Lori was able and willing and desired to jump into that with us. So what about you, Danny?
No, I loved that part too about the back end finally becoming sexy. Like it's been this thing that's been something that has to be done for so many years. And now that's where most of the really exciting things are happening. So I think it'll be really interesting. So that really stood out to me. I also loved that she talked about the book was written for the midterm. So she actually calls it the medium term. She didn't write for the long term, like, hey, here's the future. And she didn't write for this is immediate. She's like, hey, things are going to change. We're in the middle of change. And this is going to be good through, 2027, 2028, 2029. And then we're going to have to rethink this all over again. So I loved the foresight and I just blatant honesty in saying, hey, we're working through this all together. I really also love the emphasis that she put on data. We talked about data a lot through a lot of these levers and how data is going to play a big role in organizations moving forward. And then I also,
data.
Right. The final thing that stood out, we couldn't have a podcast in 2025 without discussing AI. But one of the things that I thought was interesting is we asked her the question, does AI expose the weak levers where you're weak in your levers, or does it change them? And she said it just exposes the weak ones. So the levers are the levers. The strategy is the strategy. You have to get that right. AI can enhance it or completely sink it. But these levers are sort of outside of AI, which I thought was super interesting.
Yeah, agreed. The discussion around kind of how AI weaves through it, but is not a lever, was fascinating.
Yeah. We really enjoyed our conversation with Lori, and we hope you do too. Enjoy the listen. Hey, Lori, thanks for joining us.
It is an absolute honor. Thank you.
So, Lori, we're super excited to have you on today because you spend a lot of time helping organizations with EdTech and talking to a lot of EdTech organizations. And we are right in the middle of doing quite a bit on that. So Stacia's doing a research report on AI and what's going on in organizations. We're just about to start the Learning Tech report again. And so we're deep in this. And so we're excited to talk to you at the beginning of those kinds of discussions because I think you can provide a lot of insight into kind of what's going on right now. We see a lot of organizations scrambling, both to take advantage of AI, but also to accommodate all of the changes that are occurring because of AI. And it feels like as we go after that AI piece, we get farther and farther from the goal that we actually want to hit. I don't know if you're feeling that as well. And it also feels as is often the case when we're talking about people technology, that we're leading with the tech rather than using it as a tool.
Completely. And I'm so excited to hear that you are continuing this deep dive into EdTech, because I know there's nobody better than both of you who will really bring to light what is actually happening out there. Because your point about companies struggling, they are, and they don't necessarily understand it's not that they don't understand the tech, but they don't understand necessarily the implications. And they're often disconnected from how tech is also operating in other parts of the business. And that myopic view, and also there's a fear that as they introduce new tech, that they're effectively downsizing their own team, is also in there. So there's this big mix of stuff. There's this Venn diagram that's happening, and it can be really hard, really, really hard. I don't envy CLOs and learning leaders right now.
I don't either. Before we jump deep into your book, let's talk a little bit about you. I want to give you an opportunity to brag a little bit. So tell us a little bit about yourself and why we should listen to you.
Okay. I had to recently update. I'm now 25 years in EdTech. Started as a lowly instructional designer way back. You can do the math. And worked my way up into EdTech systems. And I probably have implemented about a dozen large-scale enterprise-wide global systems, like 50,000 people or more. And so I've seen a lot of the good, bad, and the extremely ugly and gnarly stuff. And what I do right now is I work with companies on their strategies and to understand what their ecosystems will look like, especially now that you can't just stand alone in L&D. You also now need to think of talent and HR and people tech and how they all merge together. That's a bit about me. I'm Canadian in Toronto. Go Jays, go.
Very timely. We were just talking about the decider game is tomorrow for the World Series.
You've introduced it in that you have been doing this work for roughly 25 years. As we like to say, tenure doesn't necessarily equal capability. And so tell us why folks should listen to you on this topic.
I would say because I've made a lot of mistakes, or I've seen also two mistakes get made. Sometimes I wasn't in a position to get ahead of them. Other times I made them myself. And I fully admit that in the book. This is where I screwed up, and don't do the same thing. And I've also found ways to get around those elements. I think the other reason too is because I have a long-term view of tech, I also understand what's actually realistic and possible. And just because you see something out at a conference or you come across an ad, it's really understanding how that will fit in with the infrastructure that you already have. Sometimes it works really well, sometimes not, or maybe you need technical skills to make it happen. So I'd say that that's probably the reason that I would take my advice on this. And I'm also quirky and, try and have a funny take on things. And I'm not afraid to say the quiet parts out loud.
Ooh, yes. We think that's true. So your book is called 8 Levers of EdTech Transformation. And as I was reading through it this week to prepare for this, it has a very truth-telling bent to it, very much like you, Lori. We can always have very frank conversations about what's going on right now in the space and why and what stupid things people are doing. Curious about why you wrote it right this second. Like what made this timely right now?
A few reasons. I'd had the book actually for quite some time in my head, and I'd used the 8 levers methodology with clients. Putting fingers to keyboard, really, it was a few decisions. One, we are going through a significant transition in L&D and EdTech, and there are going to be jobs that are shifting. So I wanted to write something that also to give people a pathway forward to say, okay, I'm an instructional designer. What do I do when courses maybe don't exist? There's learning experience architects. What does that look like? And try to give something really very concrete. I also found too, having gone through various waves, and you've seen them too, of tech come out in our industry, you see a lot of hype and quick adoption, and then it filters out as to what actually works. And so I wanted to get ahead of that for people who are actually thinking about what do I buy? Because I really believe that the tech is not necessarily the first problem to solve. You need to think about a whole bunch of other things, hence the levers. I also wrote it too to challenge vendors a bit, to say, I wanted somebody who's read the book to then ask the tough questions, the questions that should be asked when they are in an RFP cycle. So I wanted to empower that. And so that vendors will really need to think about the things that they should be proactive about anyway.
So before we get into the actual levers, I'm curious about what you think is broken when it comes to how most organizations are facing EdTech.
What I think is broken is they buy and launch, but they're not thinking of, okay, how do I actually drive this car? It's like they buy the Porsche, they see the Porsche come, the lovely ads, and they're on the Gold Coast and there's the ocean, there's all of that. But then it's like, okay, so how do you change a gear? Do you know how to do a pit stop? Do you know how to do any of those things? And a lot of times, no. One of the big falling points, for example, is data. They'll buy a platform that has a lot of data, but they don't act on it, or they don't know what to do with it. So it falls down and they start to deliver the same things over and over again. I also think too, there's incredible consumer grade learning experiences. If you're using any LLM, if you've played around with any of the coaching models, they're very, very sophisticated, and we're not necessarily adopting that at scale or speed into our own environments. And that tension is becoming more and more pronounced. That said, L&D professionals are passionate. We want to do well. And we also have to break through some of the constraints also too that we have from SCORM really does hold us back, for example. And how can we get out of that? So it's a very interesting time.
So to continue your metaphor, you said people will see the Porsche, buy the Porsche, not think about if they can change the gears. But to what extent do people think about if they even need the Porsche?
Yes.
Like, do they need the car, or do they need the Porsche versus the Kia? Like, where is that in the decision-making process these days?
Completely. And I do mention this in the book, you may not need any tech. You may need to just maximize what you have right now. Like if you've I drive a Subaru, not well, but I drive a Subaru and gets you from point A to point B. It's got enough trunk space. It's got enough, good mileage. Exactly. So sometimes it's not even the tech that you need. And the thing that I hate when I see in a business strategy for why do I need new EdTech is we don't like the interface or the experience of my current one. That's not enough of a reason, because have you turned everything on or off? Have you configured it? Like, how are you delivering it? So I really take the reduce, reuse, recycle metaphor and really look at what do you actually have right now, and what are you maybe not using effectively or to its maximum.
So talk to me about why you used levers. It could have been steps or cycles or anything like that. And you used the metaphor or the framing of levers.
I took levers because I was going to say the Canadian levers. It keeps creeping up on me. By the end of this, maybe I'll have you saying A or levers. But I chose levers because for me, it's not an on or off. A lever to me was something that could be any stage in between. And I don't believe that you have to crank up all 8 levers and that's the only way that you are ever going to be a success. There are a lot of organizations who maybe are never going to get to maximum usage of data in what they do, but they're going to get to enough. There are going to be other ones, for example, who their target operating model, simply because of the environment they operate in, they're not going to move to the level of agility that another company might. And that's okay. That's not saying they're bad. So to me, levers was something that you can move. And the image I had in my head was, I don't know if you remember in The Wizard of Oz, or I suppose everyone's watching Wicked now, but the wizard behind the curtain, moving the levers, that's what was in my head.
So one of the points you make in the book is that you wrote this for the medium term. You mentioned as we get our bearings, because we're all in this just massive point of transition and honestly chaos as we're thinking about some of these new technology changes. As you think about the medium term, when is that? So like, how long is it going to take us to get our bearings? And how do you think L&D functions maintain their credibility until we get to that point?
Really, really good question. I think I wrote in the book, I chose 2027, but I'd look maybe towards 2028, 28. I think we're looking at it at least a two or 3 year cycle for us to get up to speed. But as I said, it'll be lining the bottom of bird cages sooner than I know it, because things just move so fast. And I know even too, from when I was writing it, there were a lot of times I actually had to pull the galley print back and been like, I need to change this and this, because there was another launch of a new functionality that in Claude or ChatGPT or any of that, I had to do those changes. It's just so rapid. But in terms of how L&D maintains credibility, I think the big one is being outcomes focused and being business focused no matter what you're doing. Any experiments that you're trying to do should have a purpose. Yes, it's great to say, okay, we're going to try and, play around with this tool and that tool. Fine. But when you start operationalizing that and you start embedding it into your workflow, you have to have that with a target in mind and with a destination in mind. How are you helping your team mitigate time or money or risk? and how is that happening? And if you can't articulate that from the onset, maybe that's not the experiment that you want to run. And be proactive about sharing. Don't wait for it to come in. Involve your business partners with the experiments right away. Find out what they're doing too, because you may find they're off already. Other people are already prompting and having courses delivered to them by a co-pilot. But it's really about still maintaining that business focus.
So I have a question. I want to go back to something that you said in the book, that you stated in the book, and you just brought it up here as well, which is sometimes tech isn't necessary. Sometimes there's not. So there's lots going on with AI right now, and there's lots going on with tech right now. But there's also lots going on just with L&D right now. We're seeing all kinds of major changes because those that haven't been strategic to this point are being sidelined in a lot of cases. And some leaders think that it could be done with a good LLM. So there's that whole thing going on. But then there's also, where do they sit in the organization? And should they be dissolved into the organization? And what does even HR look moving forward? And so it's not just like the tech and the AI thing. It's like that plus the implications of everything else that is happening right now. And so I'm curious, as you took a look at this book and as you wrote it during this time, how do you see it sort of, does it overlay all of the decisions and all the other things that are happening? Or is it a portion of a larger strategy? Or how do you view that?
I viewed it, really good question. I viewed it as sitting on top of your strategy. I viewed it as a lens that you could look through when you're making some of these decisions, particularly about how you're going to structure your team, how you're going to do just day-to-day hygiene, intake, retirement of courses, or working with SMEs. All those sorts of things. So I saw the book as a layer on top, a lens, as I said. As new tech comes out, some of these things will become redundant. I totally predict, right? I do have a lot on, for example, data, because it's something I've always been passionate about. I used to say that was the skill that everybody needed to learn. Now I flip it and say, actually, I think most people in L&D really need to have some working knowledge or proficiency with agents who will do that data analysis and come back with the insights without you ever touching a pivot table. So there's changes there.
I want to jump on that point because we actually just ran a people analytics huddle yesterday and we were talking about the same topic, right? So when you put the data out there or you make it accessible via the LLM, you are potentially opening yourself up to all sorts of additional unintended consequences. Because particularly for Danny, I mean, as people who live in data, there's a lot of art along with that science. What do you exclude? What do you include? Why might the result be slightly different? Data definitions, all this nitty gritty stuff that honestly is not very sexy, but is critical to getting the right answer. And so I guess my question in here is, how do we think about that? Because I agree, learning folks should also have agent skills and capabilities and understand what they need to do. But I am, along with some of my people analytics friends, pretty concerned about the idea that we're just going to let this data run loose and you don't actually have to understand it. You just have to consume it. Have you given that any thought?
Absolutely. And first of all, when you say it's not sexy, I just got to say you're speaking my love language. Like, I'll just fan myself here. Data, you had me at data, you had me at pivot tables, you had me at data cleansing. We're going to have a midpoint. I'll tell you where I think it's going to go. I think, first of all, I don't think it should be a free-for-all where you can do whatever you want with the data, because that frightens me on so many different levels. I think a lot of people don't understand their either jurisdictional or their industry data privacy laws and whatnot. I remember I used to be able to go into my LMS and could tell that the CEO hadn't done their anti-money laundering training. I had way too much power at a very junior position. I was a lowly administrator. That, I don't think it should be a free-for-all. I actually predict but it will be for the medium, for this term right now. I think because everybody's so excited about data, but we have to be very mindful about that. If I were a leader, I would probably be reining in what data is actually available for people to utilize and what they can actually do with it. But I also anticipate that whole data layer and analysis layer will actually be run by agents that are orchestrated, meaning that there will be certain, just like you run a report, there will be certain things that it will do automatically to mitigate some of those data privacy issues, to mitigate some of those triangulation and things that maybe we shouldn't do. So I see us moving towards it. I think that will become almost a middleware that sits on top of your data. That said, I wish people would really appreciate that a lot of your data is garbage right now, and it's in a format that cannot be used. And I say that with love. The thing that when a CLO or a leader comes to me and says, what's the one thing I should be doing right now? Much to the chagrin of my publishers, I don't say read my book. I say get somebody in to clean your data, look at the state of your data, because you're not going to be in a position to do anything unless that is clean. And it may mean that there's going to be certain things that you're not going to put into the data lake because it's just garbage in, garbage out, and it's going to infect the rest of the pool. But as much as I love the idea of people exploring, I think there's going to have to be a lot more rigor and process around how that data is actually run. I think there's also going to be a backlash by employees when it starts coming out how much data is actually collected, how it's triangulated, where's it going. I know we follow GDPR, but there's still a lot out there. And I'm just waiting for some of those breaches to come to light.
We want to move to lightning round. In the middle of every podcast, we just take a minute and we ask some questions to get to know you a little bit. 3 questions for you. The first one is, what country impacted you the most?
Without a doubt, Poland. Despite my name, Lori, I was supposed to be named Jadwiga Prędzikowska, which would have been my mother's maiden name, and Jadwiga Jadzia is a very common Polish name, but I was named Lori. I decided when I left university, I went back to Poland before cell phones, before GPS, before anything, and I went there and I lived and worked for 2 years, and I reconnected with my family there, and I still see them 2 or 3 times a year and learn the language. So best thing ever.
That's amazing.
It's fun.
I have so many more questions off of that, but that does not fit in lightning round, so I'm going to keep going. And we even talked about this last week, so I know more than what you said, but I still have questions. No. I think that's not going to be so useful for me, but thank you.
No problem.
All right. Who is the most interesting person you've met while traveling?
My husband. I met my husband on a bus. And I was traveling back from my sister's wedding from Toronto to Kingston because I was studying at university. And there was 1 seat free left on the bus. I ran to get a ticket, sat down at that seat, and I had all the bouquets from my sister's wedding because I was going to dry them. And my poor husband, who's about 2 meters tall, had to cram himself into the corner. And his thoughts were wedding or funeral, wedding or funeral. And luckily, he passed me a fisherman's friend. That was his opening line. We spoke about the Quebec referendum because he was a German exchange student, basically in Canada, studying for 6 weeks about political science. And he had me at hello, and we met almost 30 years ago last month. Yeah, 30 years ago.
Oh my gosh.
So wait, but okay, I am going to ask a follow-up. Sure. How do you go from riding on the bus with random guy who's afraid of your flowers to this 30 years married?
30 years married? Oh, we got off the bus and I had a boyfriend at the time, long gone. I think I kicked him out by Belleville, which is about halfway in between Toronto and Kingston. I was like, I'm not dealing with that. He asked for my number. I gave him my real one. And then he gave me a call when he was in Toronto, went out for dinner. And then as he went to Ottawa and then came back to Kingston, went to Montreal. I went to Montreal. Sorry, mom and dad. And then he went to Germany, of course, back home. And then I had moved to Poland. So we used to travel 24 hours by train.
No way.
Again, this was before you really had an iPhone and internet. And I used to travel 24 hours by train to meet him in Bonn or Berlin in Germany.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And then I had explained to my parents when I came home why I have a large German when I'm Polish and he's older than I am and a whole bunch of other things.
Yeah. Okay. I feel like we got to know you really well with those first 2, like things that I don't know about you and I've known you for years. We're going to lighten it up with a little bit with the last one. Would you rather be able to control time or fly?
Okay. So I hate flying anywhere. I don't like flying. I hate flying. So control time.
Yeah.
Easy.
Agreed. Totally agree.
All right, so let's jump back into it and talk a bit more about the book. One of the things that I really love about the book is that you talk about all the other things before you talk about the actual tech. What it does is interesting, but making sure it can do the thing is absolutely crucial. So can you briefly review the 8 levers that you introduced in the book?
Absolutely. And then I'm glad that you noticed that, because for me, the tech, I didn't want this to be review tech and basically be a grocery list of everything you should be buying right now, because I don't think that's feasible for anybody. And I do have to refer to the book to remember.
That's what it's for, right?
There we go. The first one is your target operating model. How does work get done? What does day-to-day look like? What's a Monday? How does that happen? Data, which I referred to before. Content strategy and learning experiences. I really do believe the static course, with the exception of risk topics, probably won't be the default moving forward. Skills. skills revolution. Everybody's talking about skills, although again, maybe this is out of date because people are talking about tasks. Again, there goes the medium term. Maybe I need to shave a year or two off of that. Stakeholder management, which I actually had the most trouble writing because I was not very good at it. And I really had to dive deep and say, how do you do this? Knowledge management and marketing. L&D has to partner, especially with knowledge management. It has to happen right now. Ecosystem thinking. Where do you sit in people tech, HR tech? And finally, strategic alignment with the business, which was kind of a no-brainer. I felt I had to include it, but it was also like, if you don't have this, forget about the other 7, because that's where you really should be focused.
So I think this is so interesting. As I was reading the book, the very first thing that jumped out to me is about a year ago, I wrote a paper on learning strategy and came up with these 17 things that you should be paying attention to if you've read that and you know it. And right now we're doing the same thing. Stacia's doing the same thing for HR. So what does an HR wheel look like with all the things that, and so when I asked you that question earlier about, does this lay on top of the thing or is it's interesting that you're basically raising at least half of the things that we associate with a strong L&D strategy and embedding tech into every one of them, or there's a deep connection with technology in every single one of those.
That makes me so happy. There's alignment. Absolutely. And it's a fantastic piece of work. I'm glad that you're doing another go at it because I think it's giving a path forward for people to look at and actually conceptualize what the future is going to be.
And and that was like, thanks for the compliment. That is always helpful to know. Other smart people think it's good. But more than that, like, I think when I was putting that together, I even put tech in a box. Like, I understand the implications in all those other areas, but I still put it in a box. And when I read your book, I was like, maybe it should be lifted up. Maybe it should be trixed across. And since we did that, Stacia and I have been talking about maybe other things should too. Like, what are the interactions between all of these things rather than just putting them in a place where you have to consider them each separately. You know what I mean?
I do think the interconnectivity is going to be a really big one because none of these operate in isolation. And especially as we're moving to things like hyper-personalization, memory as well. And also everything that is happening in L&D will ultimately be connected to, say, a CRM or the project management office. All those connectivity, that's a web that I see going through all of them. And I do believe that needs to be explicit. It's not just going to be an LMS that maybe just takes some data from the HRIS to, like your employee number and your region and all that sort of thing. It's going to be so much more. And I think that really does need to be laid out. I'm not saying that this is the specific tech to buy, but to understand the functionality that you're going to need throughout is critical.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting, like this ties back to the big conversation we were having about data a little bit earlier as well, because data comes from tech largely in organizations. And so if data is going to drive your system, which we know it is, then we should be looking at the tech that drives that data. And we're not just talking about delivery tech anymore. We're talking about technology for communication and technology for creating stuff and technology for interacting with the larger biggest business strategy and all of those types of things.
Correct. And I think also too, understanding that in the future, I think the only interface that a learner is actually going to have with learning is actually going to be through that prompt bar. That's it.
Or through voice. Voice, it's gonna change. UI doesn't matter as much as we thought it did.
Exactly. It's not going to be, with your squares on a page or your Netflix of learning. So our job is there's so much that's going to happen on that back end and to understand how those pieces all fit in to drive the most precise, contextually correct and data-driven response that's going to come up in that prompt.
Yeah. The back end got sexy. It's been unsexy for many years. And then all of a sudden I'm like, oh my gosh, think about the back end. It's so much more fun.
And that should be a tagline through the new report. The back end.
Think about the back end.
So much sexier.
So much more fun. Sexyizing the back end. Of all of the 8 levers, those 8 levers that you mentioned, do you think there's one that gets underestimated more than the others?
I used to say data because it's hard, but I think it's becoming easier. The really big one right now is I think it's ourselves. And stakeholder management, I would put in there. Even though ourselves is not a lever, I think it's one of the biggest ones right now. And it's our stakeholders, we have to paint a picture for them as to what the future will be like rather than have it dictated to us. But we need to also understand where the company's going and where they're going. All this in the book sounds really great until the first time you say no to a stakeholder. And then it just falls apart because then they go to the CEO and it appears and they say, L&D is not delivering the course that I wanted and they're not, efficient and they're not proving this. And then all of a sudden we're back to McDonald's taking orders, not because we want to, but because that is the system that we're under. So I think that's the really hard one. We need to paint that picture of what learning will actually be and how it impacts the business, not just what we think and pedagogically what it'll be, but this is what it's going to do for where we are as a business.
Do you think there's one of those levers that is more important than the others? So Danny asked if there's one that was underestimated, but is there one that's more important?
I would say right now it's the ecosystem thinking. It's because to get to that sexy backend, that's where it's going to come from. And we can't just feed into, say if that interface is coming via a Copilot or a Gemini, we can't just feed in isolation to that database. Like it has to be triangulated. And we also have to understand when those experiences are also too going to be replicated across different environments. When do you get pushed to, say, the talent marketplace when you have a particular skill? When do you appear, on this report? Or when do you get a coaching moment? How does that all happen? So we need to understand how those are interconnected.
This leads us to another really sexy topic, which is governance, right? All of this is basically governance of data and systems and such. If I could go off topic for a moment, I think there's this interesting discussion or thing that I'm seeing more broadly, which is what do all of these HR technologies look like when there isn't a front end, right? Or when everything is through the box. And I am working on a piece about a large HCM provider that wants to evolve themselves so they remain the front end. And then I feel like a lot of the other vendors are like, nope, I'm just giving up. I mean, they wouldn't say that, right? But effectively, like we acknowledge that we are going to be the back end, the sexy back end. And that's okay. But what it keeps making me wonder is like, where does differentiation come if you're just the back end on all of this?
Interesting question. I think the differentiation is going to come with what insights can you actually drive from what you're doing and what actions can you actually promote from that, what impact they will have. Because those are decision points that humans are going to have to guide on. So I think that's probably the big one that I would go with. I think also too, the differentiation is also going to be part of how you frame that back to the user through the prompt. I don't know if I'll explain this really well, but when you use, for example, OpenAI, it'll flip between GPTs depending on what you're asking it. And I do envision that's probably going to happen vis-a-vis a Copilot. It'll know, oh, you're querying HR system, HCM, 1, 2, 3, right? I won't name a brand. So it'll know that. So the quality of the response and what it's going to give back and what it's going to drive in terms of action, I think is going to be important. I also think too, the differentiator will be how those systems themselves can report on what information they have pushed out and what is actually being queried from them in a way that actually too then drives insights. Because right now that's also a black box. Like we've given everybody, access to these systems. We don't have a way we can actually pull a report and say, what are people actually looking for and what are they doing with it? But there's also going to come a point at the end of the day where like, how much data can you really be different about? How much of the pie do you want? I would urge vendors, I prefer vendors who don't have the ambition to take over the world, but are really, really good at the one thing that they do. That interests me a lot more. So I don't know if that answered the question, but that was some thoughts there.
No, I appreciate it. I don't know the answer. Whenever I ask this, I don't usually actually ask it this directly because
it scares people.
Because it scares people, exactly. Because they're like, well, you're basically telling me that a major part of my business is potentially going to just not be there. And that's scary for all sorts of reasons. And I don't know that I'm right. But I do know that where we've tried to differentiate is consumer grade UI or UX and all these expectations that the people come to the platform as opposed to the insights and the information comes to the people. And maybe that's where the differentiation is. It's not just in I ask the system for the data or the relevant learning or whatever, but the learning pops up because it sees that I can't run my pivot chart correctly in Excel or whatever.
Completely agree. And when I'm talking about insights, I actually believe in not just having the blank prompt. I see it as bidirectional in the sense that it will, the coaching agent within it or the HCM agent within it will be proactive to ask things of you or to prompt you back. So if it's learning, that agent will say, so you really want to learn project management? We got a lot of project managers here. Maybe that's not the best career choice for you. Probably wouldn't say it like that, but we don't need more basket weavers. We need some more candle makers. So it will know that. Same with the HCM. If you ask a particular question, it might prompt back, what are you specifically trying to do with this? Or what we're seeing this trend. So it's more of a conversation that's happening back and forth. That to me is actually what's really magical, because most people get stunned when they just see the blank prompt. And you need to make sure that what's happening behind the curtain is actually not just delivered. See, people go to OpenAI and it tells you what you want. It tells you you're absolutely fantastic, right? Everything you do, you're so smart. But in this instance, it's also going to be more about, this is what the business needs. This is what the company requires. This is what our people require. It's going to be a little bit more prescriptive. I think that's critical.
Oh, I have so many questions. I want to talk about this all afternoon, because that raises all kinds of other questions, like how do you buy tech? What is an insight for one organization versus another organization? Where does it get the context and all those? It's a big, huge conversation, which we do not have time for, but maybe we'll have you back and we can have that conversation. Lori, in the context of your levers and this discussion that we're having on AI right now, I'm curious, do you think that AI changes the levers in the way that you interact with those levers, or do you think it just exposes the weak ones?
I think it just exposes the weak ones. Like every single one of these levers has AI behind it and drives it. And people asked me when I wrote the book, like, why didn't you have AI as a lever? I'm like, it can't.
It's not a lever.
It doesn't work. It just doesn't fit. So to me, it's going to expose where things aren't working. That said, again, this is medium term. Like right now, when I talk to a lot of L&D organizations, they're basically looking at ADDIE and saying, how do I make it faster? And how do I insert AI into that? And I'm like, no, don't do that. Or they call it something else and say, that's the AI model. And I'm like, no, it's still ADDIE, right? So let's think about this again. And I think the entire process and our workflow is going to change. And AI will determine a lot of that and what we're able to do.
So I want to spend just a moment talking about what may be my favorite lever. I mean, it's like choosing amongst children, but I do love the skills lever, as I know that Danny does. And you chose to include it as a lever, right?
Yes.
Because in theory, it could potentially be like AI woven through everything else, but you didn't do that. So I want to understand, why did you make it one of the levers, and why do you see skills as so critical?
Really good question. I think I talk about psycho skillers and serial skillers. Yeah, like an SP. I don't know where that one came from, but I'm sure it was quite late at night. So the reason I included skills was, in my experience, a lot of L&D teams aren't really sure where they are in terms of a skills-based organization lifecycle. They're disconnected from that, or they're trying to lead it. And I'm like, no. For the latter, please don't do that. Because I unless you've been tasked with it and you have the authority and you have the data to do it, fine. But don't run off and buy a taxonomy and try and do your own thing, because that's not going to make you popular at parties. So you don't want to do that. So that was the main reason that I included skills as one, because I knew that from a maturity perspective, a lot of teams were not really wondering or not really aware of where they might be on that. The second reason is that, yes, like AI, it's woven in between, but I believe it's also in some ways a contained thing, in that it needs to have its own separate strategy. And so I see it as the spine, basically, to the body. And without that spine, all of the nervous systems that's coming out of it, that needs to be understood, and it needs to be constructed and agreed to in a way that's actually going to allow the others to operate. That's why I kept it as skills. Now, I know that there's conversation, should this be tasks? It should be competencies. I stick with skills. Skills is because psycho skiller sounded really good. Maybe that's why. Task-based taxonomy does not roll off the tongue. So I'm just making it easier. I don't know. But no matter what it is, what that spine is, it has to be something. Because I also look at, we're going to get into a supply, and this is terrible to talk about with people, but I look at this as a supply chain management process. If we really want to think about how we are right skilling people, we want to look at, and I think I used the example of tomatoes, right? How many do we have? How many do we need to grow? Can we buy them? And even how many are in tins that, are bots that we can use ad infinitum, and it doesn't matter, they're not going to spoil. So when we put that lens on top of it, that's why I really felt skills had to be its own lever, its own topic.
Okay. Yeah. I think the point about tasks as potentially being the next thing is interesting, but Danny and I believe that the two are necessary, right? That you can't, just because everyone's going to start talking about tasks doesn't mean you should abandon skills. It really is the next level down of insight into work. I think that we have to be careful not to let people just decide to go chase the next shiny thing, because they both matter.
I would agree, especially if you're talking about internal mobility, right? If somebody can perform a certain task that requires a skill, that skill may transfer. that's important.
Lori, it's been a pleasure to have you on.
Likewise. It's a lot of fun. Good questions.
Yeah, it has been, but we should do this just for kicks and giggles. We don't even have to record it next time. 2 quick questions to end up. The first one is, what's one thing that you're reading right now that you would recommend to folks?
The one thing that I am reading right now, I read a lot of things, so I'm going to try and be I won't give you my weird reading list because I read a lot of forensic stuff and autopsies and stuff, so I'm not going to get that reputation. But the one
I don't know. I think you just did.
I know. I just did. The book that it was given to me, and when it was given to me, I was like, I don't need this. But it was Let Them by Mel.
Oh, yeah. Mel.
And I'm like, I don't need this. And then I got 3 pages through it. And I'm like, oh, clearly I did. This has been a nice reframing. And I think there's some philosophy in there that I've been taking forward to what you can control and what you can't. It's a pretty basic premise, but I've enjoyed it.
I read that too. It is a helpful book. They're familiar ideas, but I don't know. The way that she presents them is just kind of, I don't know. It hit home. It was interesting.
Yes, agreed.
I had a chance to see her, being Mel Robbins, speak at an event last year. Not about this book, but about one of her previous ones. I think it's like where she talks about counting down. And I can't tell you like the number of times I've been like, okay, 3, 2, 1, move, just do something, get up, which is so silly, but useful. So
I don't think it's silly at all. And I think it's a motivator. It's a motivator.
Well, Lori, we end every podcast with the purpose question. So I'm going to offer that to you now, which is, Lori, why do you do the work that you do?
I do the work that I do mostly because when I got into learning, I realized there was a lot of bad learning out there. And I got to know a lot of people in a lot of different industries who, if they didn't stay relevant and skilled, they were going to be redundant. And the pressure that's put on them to do that, and we don't make it easy for them. So that, I would say, is the purpose behind what I do. I'm always looking at it from the lens of there's a person on the other side of that screen with a mortgage, with kids or aging parents or whatever it may be. And our job is to make sure that they are not just a number and that they actually have the potential to succeed. And I also believe, too, that everybody has potential and you have to find it in people. And sometimes it won't fit a traditional box. And that's important. That's important to me.
Thanks for being with us, Lori.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, that's a wrap for this episode of Workplace Stories. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to our podcast so that you can be the first to know about future episodes. For exclusive access to our research, insights, and a vibrant network of human capital leaders, consider joining the Red Thread Research community. Visit redthreadresearch.com to learn more and to take your workplace to the next level.